When 27-year-old Francesca Sullivan vanished during her solo motorcycle journey across the United States, most people assumed the worst. It had to be a crash, somewhere in the unforgiving mountain ranges of Colorado. For years her family scoured those ridgelines and valleys, clinging to a threadbare hope that she might still be out there, waiting to be found. But 6 years later, when crews pulled a rusted motorcycle from the murky depths of the Rio Grande, it shattered every assumption they had clung to. They had been searching in the wrong place all along. The first sign had been subtle, almost too small to notice. A single, missed check-in, easily brushed aside as a fluke. Francesca's parents, Eleanor and Mark, tried not to worry. It was late August 2018, and she was on the journey she had dreamed about since college, an ambitious coast-to-coast ride on her red BMW touring bike. She had mapped it meticulously, charting every route, backup route, and scenic detour. The agreement was simple, yet sacred. One call or text every evening, no matter the conditions. On August 23rd, when no message came, Eleanor reassured her husband gently. Francesca was likely deep in the Colorado Rockies, where cell reception was as elusive as a ghost. Maybe she had found a beautiful spot off the beaten path, set up her tent by a mountain stream, and was simply out of range. But even as Eleanor spoke, Mark's instincts stirred with unease. He knew his daughter. Francesca didn't just plan, she anticipated. She would have known the signal would be weak and warned them in advance. By the next evening, that unease had hardened into something darker. Every call to Francesca's phone was answered with the cold, mechanical voice of her voicemail. Her texts weren't going through either. No delivered checkmark. No reassuring ping. Her social media remained eerily still. Her last post a joyful update from 3 days prior, now frozen in time like a photograph trapped under ice. Tension began to seep into the Sullivan household like fog. Meals went untouched. Conversations became hushed and fragmented. Even breathing felt like a quiet apology for the worry swelling in the room. Eleanor sat for hours refreshing Francesca's profile, searching for signs, a tagged photo, a comment, anything to break the silence. By the morning of August 25th, the absence of contact wasn't just concerning. It was terrifying. This wasn't who Francesca was. She was experienced. She had spent countless weekends navigating winding back roads and forgotten forest trails along the East Coast. She was careful, considerate, and acutely aware of the depth of her parents' worry. This trip wasn't about rebellion. It was a celebration of her independence, yes, but not at the cost of their peace. The last trace of Francesca came in the form of a single image, an almost painfully vibrant selfie sent to her mother's phone. Taken from a low angle, it showed her beaming, bathed in sunlight. Her hair was tousled by the wind, sunglasses perched on her head, and her favorite armored jacket hugged her frame. Behind her, the red BMW stood proud, loaded with gear, framed by a backdrop of glacial peaks and a turquoise lake so surreal it looked digitally enhanced. The message accompanying the photo read, "Made it to the top of the world. Unbelievable. Love you." At the time, it was a gift, proof of life and joy. But in hindsight, it felt like a farewell, a memory fossilized in pixels. That radiant moment became the final pin on an unforgiving map. At the 72-hour mark, dread finally outweighed denial. Mark Sullivan dialed the Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office in Lake City, Colorado. His voice was steady, but the emotional strain was unmistakable. He gave them everything: her full name, date of birth, a description of her bike and clothing, and that haunting final photo. The mountains in the background helped triangulate her possible location to the San Juan Range, a wilderness known for its breathtaking beauty and deadly terrain. Detective David Miller was assigned the case, a seasoned investigator with a calm demeanor and skin tanned by decades of high-altitude sun. Miller had seen it all. In his experience, these cases went one of two ways: miraculous rescues, or grim discoveries. Privately, he feared the latter. Miller began with the basics: timeline, location, evidence. He filed emergency warrants to access Francesca's bank and cell data. He knew digital footprints didn't lie. Within 48 hours, the first clues arrived. Her bank records told a story of movement: gas stations, small stores, rest stops, each transaction a breadcrumb westward. The last one was a $15.72 purchase at a gas station just outside Lake City, time-stamped at 11:42 a.m. on August 22nd. Her phone records painted a darker picture. The last outgoing message was the selfie. After that, nothing but failed calls and unsent texts. But one crucial detail emerged. A passive signal, or ping, had been logged later that evening. Her phone had briefly connected with a tower atop Slumgullion Pass, a jagged outcrop nearly 12,000 feet above sea level. Miller mapped it. The signal's range stretched across a staggering 300 square miles of rugged, merciless wilderness. She could have been anywhere, along the narrow, twisting alpine loop, buried deep within a pine-choked valley, or at the bottom of a ravine too steep for helicopters to see. Every possibility was a labyrinth of uncertainty. The most logical explanation? A tragic accident. Francesca, though seasoned on the East Coast, may have underestimated the raw hostility of Colorado's unpaved mountain roads. One miscalculated turn, one patch of gravel, and she could have been swallowed whole by the wilderness. But something didn't sit right, and soon Detective Miller would uncover a detail that flipped the narrative and unraveled everything they thought they knew. It takes only one split second, one misjudged turn on a gravel-strewn road, to change everything. Investigators feared that's exactly what had happened. Francesca, unfamiliar with the raw brutality of Colorado's backcountry, may have lost control on a blind curve. Her and her motorcycle possibly tumbling silently off an embankment, disappearing into the dense underbrush where no headlights could reach. And so, the official search began. Not with hope, but with grim determination. The Hinsdale County Sheriff's Office quickly mobilized, coordinating with the Civil Air Patrol to scan the vast wilderness from above. For 3 days straight, a single-engine Cessna traced slow, surgical grid patterns over the jagged expanse. From 1,000 feet in the air, pilots and spotters squinted into the blur of forested peaks and shadowed valleys, praying to catch a glint of metal or flash of red, anything that might signal Francesca's last stand. But the San Juan Mountains don't give up their secrets easily. The terrain was merciless. Massive granite cliffs dropped into tangled mazes of spruce and pine. Even a bright red motorcycle could vanish into that wilderness like a single drop in an ocean. Meanwhile, ground teams rolled through the narrow trails and high passes in rugged 4x4s, scanning every pull-off, every overlook, every slope. They searched for broken branches, disturbed gravel, any sign of impact. But the landscape was eerily still, offering no answers. As the days stretched on and the miles piled up, hope began to feel like an illusion. The emotional toll on everyone involved, detectives, volunteers, and especially the Sullivan family, was immeasurable. The beauty of the wilderness turned hostile, its silence no longer serene, but suffocating. By the 4th day, Detective Miller knew they needed a new angle. Francesca hadn't just passed through these roads. She'd interacted with people, and people noticed things. He began retracing her likely path, visiting every gas station, diner, and roadside motel along her route. He carried a stack of flyers, each one bearing Francesca's radiant smile and a snapshot of her red BMW. At a quaint, wood-paneled inn on the outskirts of Lake City, a man named George, the motel owner, paused as he looked at the flyer. "Yes," he said quietly. She was here. George recalled her vividly. Her energy had filled the room like sunshine spilling through a window. She spoke with joy about her travels, unguarded and bright-eyed. But just as Miller turned to leave, George hesitated, then added something that would shift the course of the investigation. Francesca had told him about a strange encounter that day at the gas station in town. She'd brushed it off as odd, even joked about it, but it had clearly unsettled her. A man had approached her while she fueled up, tall, lean, wearing a worn-out cap and scuffed boots. He wasn't simply admiring the bike. He was asking invasive questions. Was she traveling alone? Where was she headed? His tone, she said, made her skin crawl. For Francesca to mention it at all meant it had lingered with her. Miller's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a possible lead. It was a doorway to a whole new theory. Maybe this wasn't an accident. Maybe someone had followed her. He drove straight to the gas station. The manager didn't hesitate to roll back the security footage. The video was grainy, but there she was, Francesca in her blue jacket, standing beside her bike. And then the man entered the frame. His body language was invasive, leaning too close, hands gesturing in a way that seemed just a little too forceful. Francesca's stance told its own story, polite but clearly guarded. A still image of the man was circulated. A deputy recognized him immediately. He was known in the area, a seasonal laborer drifting from town to town. No known violent offenses, but a record for petty theft. His name was entered into a statewide BOLO, be on the lookout. For a brief moment, the investigation surged with energy. Maybe this was the break they needed. Perhaps he had followed her, found her isolated in the mountains. But just as quickly, the hope unraveled. 2 weeks later, a sheriff's deputy in Wyoming found him on a cattle ranch. Cooperative, calm, even confused by the questioning, the man admitted to speaking with Francesca. He said he'd been in awe of the bike, never having seen a BMW like hers. He provided time cards, employer statements, and GPS records proving he had been hundreds of miles away when she disappeared. Once again, the trail dissolved into smoke. As September bled into October, the golden shimmer of the aspens faded into a bleak, skeletal gray. Cold swept through the mountains. The first snow arrived early, thick and heavy, erasing all signs of movement. Whatever evidence might have remained, tire marks, debris, even the bike, was now buried beneath a blanket of white. Detective Miller had no choice. He met with the sheriff and the head of search and rescue. The verdict was as bitter as it was inevitable. The active search had to be suspended. He made the call to the Sullivans himself. On the other end of the line, the silence from Eleanor and Mark spoke louder than grief ever could. He reassured them that the case would remain open, that spring would bring new opportunities. But deep down, they all understood. The case was going cold. The file, thick with maps and reports and heartbreak, was quietly placed in the bottom drawer of Miller's cabinet. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Spring 2019 brought with it a slow, aching thaw. The rivers surged, fed by months of ice and silence, but for the Sullivans, it brought no peace. The sheriff's office was clear. There would be no renewed search. Resources were stretched, and without new leads, they couldn't justify another sweep. But Francesca was not just a file in a drawer to her parents. That summer, on the 1-year anniversary of her disappearance, Mark and Eleanor packed their car and drove the 1,800 miles from Pennsylvania to Colorado. It wasn't a vacation. It was a pilgrimage. They turned a tiny motel room into a mission hub. They brought a printer, stacks of paper, boxes of ink. They printed thousands of flyers, each one a silent scream. Each day they ventured out in their sedan, retracing Francesca's route. But they weren't seeing Colorado's majestic beauty. They were searching for ghosts. Every cliffside turnout became a possible crash site. Every shadowed ravine, a potential grave. In every town they passed through, they plastered bulletin boards, asked questions, revisited the same conversations. Their voices, once steady and hopeful, grew raw from repetition. Some locals remembered the story and offered condolences. Others had seen too many families like theirs, grieving, determined, ultimately unheard. But they didn't stop. Because when the world forgets your child, you fight to remind it. Some people responded with sympathy, offering kind words and memories, but others were cold, dismissive, annoyed even by what they saw as a disruption. To Mark and Eleanor, each encounter was a fresh reminder of the chasm between their grief and the world's indifference. Time had moved on for everyone else, but for them, it had frozen in place the moment their daughter disappeared. As their physical search yielded only fatigue and sorrow, a different hunt began to gain momentum, one that unfolded not in forests or ravines, but in glowing screens and quiet bedrooms across the country. Francesca's story, vivid, mysterious, tragic, was igniting the imaginations of online communities. Motorcycle forums and true crime threads lit up with discussion. Digital sleuths, some retired detectives, others ordinary people with extraordinary obsessions, began tearing apart the case detail by detail. These were not casual observers. These were people who zoomed in on pixels, studied shadows, and compared geological maps with the precision of forensic cartographers. Her final photograph, sun-drenched and joyful, became a centerpiece. Users analyzed the position of the sun to calculate the exact time of day it was taken. They matched the jagged silhouette of mountains in the background to topographical overlays, sparking fierce debates over which glacial lake she'd stood beside. Theories emerged like spiderwebs, some plausible, some disturbingly imaginative. Had Francesca taken an unlisted back road that law enforcement missed? Had she stopped at a remote site where she encountered danger? Or, in the most fringe corners, people speculated whether she had staged her own disappearance, fleeing into anonymity to start over. Mark Sullivan read it all. Each night, long after Eleanor had retreated to bed, he sat in the dim glow of his laptop. He scrolled through every comment, followed every hyperlink, fed by a hope so thin it barely had form. These forums were a lifeline, but also a torment. To see strangers, often anonymous, speculate about his daughter's final moments, to read theories painted in gruesome color, it was like reliving her loss over and over. And yet, he couldn't look away. Because what if, buried in those threads, was something real? A detail the police had overlooked. A fresh angle. Months turned into years. The wild digital energy that once swarmed around Francesca's story dulled to a whisper. Seasons changed in the Rockies. Summer into fall, fall into snow. 2 years became 3. Then, quietly, it happened. In the fall of 2021, hope crashed back into their lives like a lightning strike. A woman from Ohio called the National Missing Persons Hotline. While on a road trip with her husband, she had stopped at a roadside diner in northern Arizona. There, she said, a waitress served them. Brown hair, about the right age, a soft voice, and eyes that carried a grief too deep for a stranger. The resemblance to Francesca, she said, was uncanny. When the Sullivan family received the message, it shattered their numbness. After 3 years of painful silence, here was a pulse. Something, anything to hold on to. They told themselves not to get carried away. They knew the statistics. How often tips like this ended in disappointment, but hope doesn't abide by logic. Eleanor imagined the moment, the hug, the questions, the story Francesca would tell. Mark, for the first time in years, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his daughter had survived. That somewhere, behind a new name and a quiet life, she had endured. The lead was passed to a local sheriff's department in Arizona. A deputy was dispatched to the diner, a squat building nestled beside a lonely stretch of desert highway. Inside, the scent of coffee hung thick in the air, the windows fogged with grease and heat. He spotted her immediately, the woman the tipster had described. Brown hair tied back, moving with quiet precision between tables, pouring coffee, scribbling checks. He approached her gently and asked if they could speak in private. In the cramped back office, He explained everything. About Francesca, the flyer, the photo. The woman looked at the picture, her brow furrowed. For a brief moment, her expression flickered. Then she shook her head. She pulled out her driver's license. The name and birth date were different. Her life was not a mystery. She had always lived there, she said. A single mother working 2 jobs, her sadness the residue of her own private battles. The lead was dead. The call to the Sullivans was curt, sterile. Another door slammed shut. But this one hurt more. The sting of raised hope was sharper than the ache of silence. It was like losing her all over again, Eleanor later whispered to a friend. The crash back into emptiness was swift and brutal. By 2023, 5 long years since Francesca vanished, the case had moved beyond cold. It was cryogenic, frozen by time, untouched by answers. Detective Miller had since retired. His files, meticulously organized, were handed to a young investigator already drowning in active crimes. Francesca's thick binder sat quietly on a shelf, its spine marked with her name, collecting dust. The flyers, once taped lovingly to gas station windows and grocery store walls, had long since faded or been torn down. Online forums that once buzzed with energy were now hushed, her thread buried beneath new obsessions. When a user occasionally asked, "Any updates?" the response was always the same. Numbered to the outside world, Francesca Sullivan had become a ghost, a name in an archive. But to her family, she remained vivid and painfully present. She lived in every breath they took, in every sunrise that came without her. Grief, over time, had transformed, no longer sharp and screaming. It had turned quiet, slow, and relentless, like a weight they carried inside their bones. The absence of answers was its own form of torment, a question that screamed into the void every day. Where is she? And then, after 6 long years, the earth itself stirred. The answer wouldn't come from tireless detectives or a last-minute confession. It would be delivered by nature itself, violent, raw, and indiscriminate. In late summer 2024, a historic monsoon swept across the American Southwest. A relentless stream of tropical moisture stalled over the region, unleashing days of torrential rain. Rivers that had trickled dry for decades suddenly roared back to life. In northern New Mexico, the Rio Grande transformed from a slow, muddy vein into a snarling beast. Water surged beyond its banks, dragging trees, rocks, and anything in its path. The gorge echoed with the grinding of stone, the hiss of violent current, and the roar of a flood not seen in generations. When the water finally receded, it left behind a scarred and altered landscape. Ben Carter, a seasoned river guide, couldn't resist the pull. He knew the Rio Grande Gorge like an old friend, its bends, its secrets. Paddling through its turbulent waters days after the flood, he navigated the altered river with reverence and caution. Fallen trees choked the banks. Debris formed twisted knots in places that once ran clean. Then, in a secluded stretch of canyon known as the Taos Box, something caught his eye. It was color, faint but out of place. A patch of dulled red, buried in the driftwood against the west bank. At first, he thought it was a piece of trash. A rusted barrel, maybe. But as he fought the current to approach, he saw it. Handlebars. Half buried in silt and tangled roots was the unmistakable curve of a motorcycle. Its red paint scraped and dull, but still clinging to memory. Ben's chest tightened. No one crashes here. This wasn't a roadside cliff. It was a remote, untouched wilderness accessible only by water. This wasn't an accident. And suddenly, the silence of 6 years began to fracture. There were no trails, no back roads. Just the cathedral-like cliffs of the Rio Grande Gorge, rising like ancient stone walls on either side of the churning river. For a motorcycle to be found there, in that precise, unreachable spot, meant only one thing. It had been placed there on purpose. It hadn't tumbled down a slope. It hadn't washed in from some distant bend. Someone, or something, had brought it to that impossible place. Ben Carter's pulse thundered as the realization set in. He backed his kayak from the debris field, imprinting the jagged silhouettes of the rock formations above into memory. He began paddling with urgency, muscles burning as he fought the current, slicing through the turbulent waters. It took nearly 2 miles of navigating the narrow gorge before the canyon widened just enough to allow a sliver of signal to penetrate. There, on a sandy spit of riverbank, hands trembling, he retrieved his phone and called 911. His voice was surprisingly calm as he relayed what he'd seen, detailing the location with remarkable clarity. The call was routed to the New Mexico State Police. Officers responded quickly, driving to the nearest overlook at Manby Hot Springs. Armed with high-powered binoculars, they scanned the riverbank. And there it was, just as Carter had described, a flash of faded red wedged in driftwood. But the reality hit hard. A ground recovery was impossible. The gorge was far too steep. The river, still swollen and violent, made access from below equally deadly. There was only one option. The next morning, the sound of whirring rotor blades broke the stillness of the canyon. A sleek, black Bell 407 helicopter emblazoned with state police swept into view, hugging the walls of the gorge as it hovered above the swirling river. On board were 2 specialists, a tactical flight officer and a veteran police diver, clad in a dark, dry suit that looked almost ceremonial in its severity. The diver descended into the river like a phantom, suspended by a steel cable, disappearing into the murky depths. Above, the helicopter held its hover with surgical precision, fighting against unpredictable canyon winds. Below, the diver struggled through silt and sunken timber to reach the motorcycle. He worked in silence, carving through debris, securing lifting straps to the frame with painstaking care. Then, he gave the signal. The cable went taut. At first, nothing happened. Then the mud released its grip with a sickening, wet groan. Out of the depths, the red motorcycle rose, a monstrous, river-soaked relic. Mud oozed from its cracks. Algae clung to its frame. The machine that had once symbolized freedom and adventure now looked like a corpse. Suspended in midair, it twisted slowly, a haunted silhouette against the vast canyon. In the background, the arching steel of the Rio Grande Gorge bridge gleamed in the morning sun, watching like a sentinel from above. The helicopter carried its cargo a mile downstream and gently set it down on a sandbar where officers and forensic techs waited. As soon as it touched the ground, the team moved in. One officer knelt, carefully wiping mud from the steering column, searching for the one thing that could confirm the unthinkable. He found it. A thin metal plate. A VIN number, etched and weathered but legible. He read the numbers aloud. The silence that followed was only broken by the soft hiss of the river and the crackle of the police radio. Then the voice of the dispatcher came through, clear, shaken. The VIN was a match. The bike was a 2016 BMW G310R, registered to Francesca Sullivan. The case, once filed under cold cases in Hinsdale County, Colorado, was suddenly very, very warm. Every officer froze. They understood instantly. This wasn't local. This wasn't recent. This was a 6-year-old mystery pulled from the depths of an ancient river. In New Mexico, the case landed on the desk of Detective Mateo Reyes. He was known not just for his diligence, but for his empathy, rare among those who handled brutal truths for a living. Reyes wasn't just chasing facts. He was chasing closure. Grief. The kind that calcifies inside families, generation after generation. His first act wasn't procedural. It was human. He called David Miller, now retired, living quietly in Colorado. Reyes recounted what had happened, how a kayaker's instinct had unearthed a ghost. Miller was silent for a long time. For years he had lived with the feeling that something had been missed, something essential. Now, the discovery hundreds of miles south vindicated that gnawing suspicion. Then came the harder call. Mark Sullivan answered on the second ring. Reyes explained slowly, gently. The motorcycle had been found. In New Mexico, in the Rio Grande Gorge. On the other end, the silence was devastating. Then a breath, a gasp, from Eleanor. For years they had danced with the hope that maybe Francesca had simply chosen to disappear, that maybe she was somewhere, living quietly, just not ready to come home. That illusion shattered instantly. The discovery didn't bring closure, it brought fear. Because if the motorcycle had just now emerged, what did that mean about the last 6 years? The red BMW was transported with care to the New Mexico State Police Crime Lab. In a sterile, brightly lit bay, far from the wilderness, it was studied like a relic. The first expert to examine it was a forensic metallurgist, and what he found changed everything. The corrosion, he explained, wasn't consistent with 6 years underwater. The rust was superficial. The microbial colonies, bacteria, algae, and silt, showed only a single season of growth. His conclusion? The motorcycle had been submerged for less than a year, perhaps only 6 to 8 months. This revelation collapsed the established timeline. Where had the bike been for the 5 years before it entered the river? Then came the second shock, delivered by a vehicle impact analyst. He studied the structural damage. What he saw didn't match any typical crash. There were no side scrapes, no road rash, no bent handlebars or twisted frames from sliding along gravel. Instead, the damage was symmetrical, vertical. The suspension was destroyed. The wheels were buckled inward. The engine casing cracked. It was as if the motorcycle had dropped straight down, from a great height, and landed flat. The investigator's final note sent chills down Reyes's spine. The damage is consistent with a free fall from a significant height into water. The initial impact was cushioned, but the structural failure was catastrophic. Reyes didn't need a map. He already knew. Less than a quarter-mile upstream from the recovery site was the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge, 650 feet above the canyon floor. There was no way to ride down, no path, no ramp. The bike didn't get there by accident. Someone had dropped it, or Francesca had. And suddenly, what had begun as a missing persons case had morphed into something far darker. There was no longer any doubt. Francesca Sullivan's motorcycle had not been lost in the wilderness. It had been pushed or dropped intentionally from the towering heights of the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge. In the main operations room at the New Mexico State Police headquarters, Detective Mateo Reyes stood before a whiteboard that bore the scars of an investigation rewritten in real time. With a sharp stroke of his marker, he slashed through the old assumption that had haunted 2 states for years. Accidental crash, Colorado, 2018. That theory was no longer just outdated. It was a lie that had obscured the truth for 6 long years. He began reconstructing the timeline, this time with science, not speculation. Francesca had disappeared in 2018, but her motorcycle hadn't vanished that same day. It had been held, kept, hidden, possibly preserved, by an unknown person for at least 5 years. Then, in the darkness of late 2023 or early 2024, that person had driven it to the center of the gorge bridge and cast it into the river below. A calculated disposal. Not panic, not haste. A cold, deliberate decision to erase the last piece of evidence. That changed everything. Reyes immediately submitted the formal request. The case's status was changed from a cold missing persons file to an active homicide investigation. Jurisdiction blurred. This wasn't Colorado's burden anymore. It belonged to New Mexico now, and it wasn't just a mystery. It was a murder. The red BMW, once a symbol of freedom and independence, was now a crime scene. A 6-year-old murder weapon soaked in time and tragedy. Forensic technicians disassembled the bike piece by piece under sterile, controlled conditions. They knew most evidence would have been erased by time, water, and impact, but they had to try. Sometimes Evidence hides in the most impossible corners, and this time, it did. One technician, a meticulous young analyst working on the air intake, removed the fuel tank to access the airbox, a sealed component of the bike built to filter air before it reached the engine. He found something no one expected. Not a leaf, not a twig, but something human-made. Wedged beside the paper filter was a small, brittle square of folded paper. Carefully, using forceps, he unfolded it. It was a torn section of a printed road atlas. Glossy, slightly water-stained, but mostly intact. Red and blue lines mapped the rural roads of northern New Mexico, near the Colorado border. One tiny town, almost invisible, had been faintly circled in blue ink. It was the break they'd been praying for. No one could explain why the map fragment had survived, protected inside that plastic chamber, but it had. Whether it had been placed there by Francesca herself, an overlooked scrap of her navigation, or left behind by her killer, it was now a beacon, a fragment of the past preserved in silence. Reyes didn't treat it as a clue. He treated it as a compass. He redrew the story on the whiteboard. Francesca hadn't died in Colorado. She had crossed the border into New Mexico, likely following her map, likely unaware she was approaching the end of her journey. Somewhere along that route, she was intercepted, murdered. Her killer, for reasons still unknown, kept the motorcycle hidden for 5 years, a secret that grew heavier with time. Perhaps it was a trophy, or maybe he simply didn't know how to dispose of it without raising suspicion. Eventually, he made a choice, to rid himself of it completely, to make it disappear in the chaos of a monsoon-swollen river. He likely believed it would never be found. But rivers remember. Reyes mobilized a multi-agency task force. Officers, search and rescue teams, volunteers, all focused on the sparsely populated county marked on the map. They searched the sun-scorched wilderness, walking slow grid patterns across arid fields and jagged canyons. They explored abandoned ranch houses and dry creek beds. They questioned longtime locals, holding up Francesca's photograph. But the trail was cold, 6 years cold. No one remembered a solo female motorcyclist. The desert had swallowed her memory like it had her body. The search ended without answers. Another heartbreaking dead end. And then, once again, it was the river that spoke. Weeks after official efforts had ceased, a geology professor from the University of New Mexico ventured into the canyon to study flood patterns. She was focused on sediment disruption when she spotted something pale jutting from a freshly eroded riverbank. It wasn't stone, it was bone. Reyes returned with a forensic team and an anthropologist from the Office of the Medical Investigator. They conducted a painstaking excavation, unearthing fragmented human remains embedded in the compacted earth. The skeleton was incomplete, but what they found painted a partial picture. Female, late 20s, height approximately 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 8 inches. Then came the detail that changed everything. The right clavicle bore the signature of a fully healed fracture, a raised ridge of bone, an old injury, years healed. The Sullivan file from 2018 held the final puzzle piece. Francesca, at 16, had suffered a severe clavicle break in a cycling accident. The location and angle of the injury matched the bone exactly. The identification was as close to certain as science could get, but the bones didn't reveal how she died. No trauma, no bullets, no knife marks. Her final moments remained sealed in silence. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide, but the manner of death was undetermined. The call to the Sullivans this time brought no hope, no ambiguity, just sorrow, cold and complete. The pain of not knowing had been replaced by the agony of certainty. Francesca was gone. She had never made it home. Her voice had been silenced somewhere in the wilds of New Mexico, her body hidden until nature itself decided to speak. Her death was no longer a question, it was a fact. But the truth of her final hours, and the name of the person who took her life, remained hidden in the dust and silence of the desert. Today, the case remains open. A single file, a name on a whiteboard, a haunting photo that once captured her smiling in the sun, a ghost story rewritten in blood and mud, still waiting for the final piece. Until that day comes, Francesca Sullivan's story lingers, an unsolved echo in the high desert wind.